Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. Super excited to share with you the progress on my EPP quilt that we have been talking about forever now. If you're watching live, thank you for joining me. As always, you can type your questions in the type chat, and Jessica, my awesome right-hand woman, will be behind the camera writing those down, and she'll give them to me at the end. If you're not watching live, no worries. You can leave them in the comments. From time to time, I get on there and answer them. And in this week's live chat, I'm going to be showing you the finished product from my EPP quilt. So English paper piecing quilt. I actually started talking about this probably about a month ago when I showed you the finished quilt top, and we kind of talked about my process for picking out the quilting designs. And then I didn't quite get it done in time for the next live chat, so I showed you part of it. And good news, I did get it all finished this morning, put the final touches on it, and I can show you the finished result. I'm going to show you kind of some in-progress pictures, and besides just looking at a really pretty quilt, I hope it gives you a little bit of peek into kind of what goes through my mind when I'm picking out designs. When I'm actually taking pictures and thinking about it, I realize I'm pretty nuts. I'm like, wow, I really overthink this stuff. You don't have to go as crazy as I do. The quilting doesn't have to be as over the top as I like to do it, but it'll just show you that, you know, even if you've done it for years and years and years, you still might make mistakes and you still might rip out quilting. So let's get to the actual quilt and we'll see how it turned out. I actually have it here, but it's not bound, and it's easier to see in a picture, so we'll just use the picture to show it. Now, for those of you that maybe didn't catch that live chat a few weeks ago, this is the finished quilt top. Don't be super impressed because that center circle is only about this big, and it took me an hour or a year and a half to make, but I loved the color placement and really wanted to have fun quilting it. Now, when we saw the live chat 2 weeks ago, I got this far. I had the center quilted and the first kind of ring around the outside. And then if you haven't seen that live chat, you can watch that on my YouTube channel. I kind of talked about how I went from block to block, how I handled, you know, an English paper piece block, and then how I did a little bit of that detail around the outside. But I still had plenty more around the outside to work on, and so let's see how that progressed. So the next row, I decided to kind of stay with the same theme of using a reference point a set distance away and using my smiley ruler, it's an arc ruler, to create the shape. Except this time I decided to flip it around. Instead of making it kind of curved like a flower, I kind of inverted it to look more like a mandala kind of shape. And at this point, I was kind of loving how it looked. I like how the pieces are nice and small, but, you know, adding some detail to it. And I think I did, you can kind of see how I'm measuring that out. I loved that I didn't have to mark the whole thing out before I started. I just kind of marked reference points on each ring of the quilting. We're going to see in a little bit how that might not always work out the best, but right here it's still working out great. So I have my reference point, I'm using my ruler to quilt to it, and then to the next quilted line. So kind of building off of that previously quilted line. And then we can see the next row. So I did the same thing, same kind of shape, set distance away to create those two rings. Really, the reason was I couldn't decide what to do in that first shape. So I'm like, oh, let's just get my grid work put on here. Let's get the outline, and then I can come back and fill it in. I will say that when I'm working on a quilt, especially a quilt with lots of blocks on it, the first block always takes the longest for me to figure out how I'm gonna work my way around. Well, the problem is this quilt was just one big block, so everything was very inefficient. There were so many times I thought, oh, if I had known what I was gonna do here, I could have just done it. But you know, it is what it is. The process is just how it goes. So you can kind of see me adding to that detail and working my way around. Now, the quilt itself is actually very rectangular. It's going to go on a wall, so it doesn't have to be, you know, a practical size. And so the quilting is, you know, there's not as much room on the sides. So I just quilted it till it ran off the edge, and then I knew I would trim it up later. So here's kind of how this is progressing. This is actually a couple weeks ago. I mean, I got about this far and I was feeling pretty good, but if you've ever hit like a creative stumbling block or you get stuck, I get really kind of like frustrated and I just avoid it for a while. So it was like intense quilting with like days in between. And truly, the only reason I probably got it done is I knew I had to eventually finish it up to show it on my live chat. So at this point, I'm just like, I don't know what I'm going to do in these shapes, right? Like I know I love those pebbles, but I don't want to do those everywhere. I don't want the quilting in the background to be too overwhelming to the top. And so I couldn't decide what to do. Kind of mulled over it for a while, and here you can kind of see all the grid work on there. on the whole quilt on my machine. And so I'm like, ugh. So I gave it the evil eye a couple times. I don't know if you've ever tried it. It doesn't help, but it makes you feel a little bit better when you walk by your project and you kind of glare at it like, ugh, I don't know how I'm gonna quilt you. But then eventually I decided to go with the plume feather. So the plume feather is great because it fits irregular shapes such as this. Now you can kind of see in the very bottom right corner, I have a little continuous curve. I liked the light density of that compared to the pebbles. And that's why I knew I didn't want to do like anything super dense relatively in that part. And so it took me a while to decide like, oh yeah, I'm going to do the plume feather. So I echoed the inside of the shape and did that kind of plume feather in there. I like how it's nice and dense, but not too over the top. It's pretty quick. And you still lets that kind of echo line around the outside show. So very happy about that once it clicked. And then in that other little spot, I was kind of torn because, I want it to be interesting, but not difficult. And it kind of hit me that when I talked about the center of the quilt, I had showed where I used some wishbones in a part because I didn't really have time to do pebbles. So I decided to add some echoing to take that shape and make it a little bit easier to manage, and I quilted wishbones in it. So if you look at that shape, it's kind of really pointy and kind of narrow at the sides. So I echoed the top of it a couple times, really just to separate the quilting, kind of make it a little bit easier to manage. So if you're stuck with those areas and you're like, oh, it's just not quite right, use the quilting to make it a little bit easier. So you can see I echoed it twice so I could fill in the rest of that space with wishbones. Now you might be thinking, wow, Angela, why twice? Is this deep artistic reason? No. I knew if I echoed it twice and quilted wishbones, I would end on the opposite side of the area so I could go on to the next block or not next space easily. So it was more of a, how do I get where I need to go without having to do even more tie-offs? Plus it just happened to work out. So a couple little echo lines and then wishbones within that area. Now, of course, you can see in the corners, there's not much room. So I just kind of get out there and start quilting it. You don't have to make that sound when you're quilting it, but it really does help. So quilting the wishbones gave it, a nice texture, really made that echoing pop, but didn't take quite as long as those pebbles. And as you can tell, I'm now lined up to do the next area. So that particular section was actually pretty efficient and quick to work through, thankfully, because the plume feathers took, longer than they probably should have. So now you can kind of see the progress. And of course, at this point, I'm now back to being happy with how it looks. I think the mood swings of the quilting process are just how it goes, right? Elation, frustration, happiness, gnashing of teeth. So you can see how it's looking. I'm super happy, but I still have more sections to fill in, and I'm still not sure what I'm going to do. So up close picture of the edge, I just quilted those lines as though it were going to continue on and knew I would kind of trim it up. So it's kind of messy there now, but I knew, well, eventually I'll trim it and it'll look fine. And then there you can see that next step. Now, if I'm being honest with you, at this point, I'm thinking, can I just trim this whole piece down and call it good? Because it's just like I can't think of what to do in this next section. Those areas are getting bigger and bigger. And so if I keep connecting the points like I was doing, it was just going to be maybe not quite how I wanted it. So this is the space I was dealing with. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do. So I realized that a lot of the times when I get stuck, I like to take a picture with my phone and doodle. And so then I saved some of them to put on here. Do not laugh at the quality of that. I'm just kind of scribbling, but it gives you an idea of like what I'm thinking about. Like, oh my gosh, what can I quilt that's not going to be super difficult, that doesn't require a lot of marking, that will build off of this. So the first thing I thought on the top was I would do like some dot to dot, like some geometric, because that's what's in the center. There's some geometric shapes. I figured it would match. I don't know. I ended up saying no to that. And then I thought, you know what? On the right, maybe I just leave this mandala thing behind. In my mind, I was going to carry it off to the edge, but maybe I just leave that and I quilt some shapes and some filler in the background, which I liked that. But honestly, I didn't have the right ruler for that shape and I just got frustrated. So then I decided to go with the bottom option. I thought, okay, maybe I'll do this idea of connecting these points and then add another layer. All right, let's just go. Sometimes you just have to like do something. And when I get to those points where I just am so like stuck, I'm like, okay, just pick a thing and just go. at least I'm closer to where I was. So here's the first part. Now I quilted that first line, connecting the point, going out and down, and I immediately did not like it. Okay, so what happens if you quilt something you don't like how it looks? Now I know, I'm like the queen of don't rip it out, keep going, but I just did not love this because it's not symmetrical on both sides. Now, this is also when I realized how neurotic I sound about my quilting. You probably are looking like it's not that bad, but I knew that since the shapes weren't all exactly perfect, it wouldn't be symmetrical on both sides, and it would just be really noticeable. I always like to joke that I'm not a better quilter than anybody. I just know how to hide my mistakes better, and I also know what's not going to look right no matter how hard I try. So I got this far in, and I kind of was at like a thing. I'm like, I could rip this out quickly and easily, recalibrate, reevaluate, and move on, or I can just go with it. And I decided to rip it out. And I took pictures of it so that you could see that. So this is me not liking it, and then this is it now gone. So you can see where it just came out real quick. When I say don't rip out quilting, I'm really talking to the quilter out there that's like learning how to quilt swirls and isn't loving the swirl and wants to rip it all out. And I'm like, no, you have to keep going. But there are times when it doesn't fit your vision, or it's not in the right spot, or for peace of mind, you have to take it out. So I had to eat a little bit of my own medicine there. You can kind of see the quilting in those spots there, and I just thought, I didn't take a picture of this, but if you ever do rip out quilting and you don't like the little holes that are left behind, you can get a clean, new toothbrush, dip it in some warm water, and just gently brush the fabric, and it will just kind of close up those holes. It's not necessarily a hole in the quilt, it's just a hole in the fabric, it's just where the fibers have spread apart. I didn't do that. I mean, I did a little bit, but I knew that the quilting was going to go over the top of it, and then when I was done, if it still stood out, I would take care of it, but that's up to you how you want to handle that. But now I am still no closer than when I started, right? I'm just like, oh my gosh. So one of my go-to rules, one of my things I do is when I don't know what to do, I echo. It's just kind of like my default, right? Okay, I'm just going to echo, do something, and at this point I'm just like, I'm going to quilt swirls in the background and call it good. So I echoed around the outside, and I know this picture's kind of weird, but I just added some more echo lines around the outside of that shape. And so then I'm like, all right, I echoed it. I still don't know what I'm going to do in the background. And so finally I was just like, I'm going to kind of go back to that idea of adding the different shapes, but I'm going to just create a different shape here. So this is the shape I decided to go with. I'm like, well, we got to do this thing, right? So I quilted this kind of shape with the smiley ruler, kind of combining the two ideas, right? The kind of curvy like a flower and the inverted. And I liked it. I'm like, okay, this is good. But then I realized, like, I don't know how to mark that or reproduce it. I kind of just wung it, just went for it. And so I'm like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I probably should have a way to go about it. So I got super high tech and I made a paper template. So I just kind of traced it and drew it out just to help me audition it. Again, this might not be for every quilt or every person, but I was just like, oh, I made it this far. Let's do something. So I cut out my piece of paper and I could position where I want it and mark a reference dot so that I can then quilt it. So here's that kind of shape out there. All right, so I'm like, at this point, I'm just, okay, it's good, it's fine, it's gonna be great. I just need to frickin' finish this. I'm just like, oh, so frustrated. But at least I have some kind of plan, and I knew that, okay, it's gonna be fine. So from there, I'm still not sure what to do. I realized, like, there's a lot of like unsurety here. And I think it's because, I'm gonna pause real quick. There's this saying sometimes in design or graphic design, it's like sometimes you have to kill your baby, right? This idea, like sometimes you're so like tied to this idea, it's your baby, and sometimes you just have to let it go. And my baby was the idea that this mandala pattern was gonna work its way right off the edge. And I was just struggling with it, obviously. And so I thought it's time to let that baby go and maybe do something different. So that's kind of where I was heading with this shape. So adding some more echoing, you can tell that's kind of my default there. I'm just kind of echoing the other side of that shape. I kind of pointed it out to you so you can see, because there's a lot of lines going on there. You can kind of see how it creates that secondary space. Okay, so now I have another big space to fill in. And not that I'm trying to be neurotic about it, but I'm like, if I put super dense quilting in there, it's just gonna draw attention to the outside. I know that anytime we have dense quilting, it's going to draw attention to there. And I want this to be pretty and interesting and cool enough that I can show you in the live chat, but not so cool or interesting or dense that it takes away from there. So I'm still like, oh, what am I going to do? So I just skipped it. Sometimes when you come up against something that's difficult or not working, sometimes you avoid it, sometimes you lean into it. And at this point, I'm like, I'm just skipping ahead. It's kind of like the classic taking a test technique, right? If you don't know the answer, just move ahead. So I add some more echoing to the outside and I said, forget it. I'm just going to do some filler, some swirls and some pebbles. And I think that's really what I needed because it's just quicker and fun. Not that quilting with rulers isn't fun, but it's just so kind of slow and not as rewarding. So I decided to go ahead and just do an all over design here. So I did some pebbles and some swirls and just kind of had fun. Now, you might be thinking, Angela, you did all this dense quilting in the background and you just said it's going to draw attention from it. Well, a couple things. I knew that when I trimmed it up, a lot of that was going to get cut off, but I also knew that I wanted that shape to stand out, not so much the outline. So smushing down the background allows that shape to pop out. Either that or I just changed my mind because I was just tired of dealing with it. So I used that same light blue thread throughout the whole thing. I think it looks good. But now I still have that shape to fill in and that other gap. So here we go. I'm like, what am I going to do? Now this is this morning. Like I need to get this thing done because I have this other stuff to do and it's just driving me nuts. So I decided to do dot to dot quilting. One thing I love to do, or another rule that I give myself, is if I can't decide what to do, I try to do the opposite of what I've just done. So I've just did all that dense quilting. I'm like, ooh, let's do some geometric dot to dot. And I think it really does fit with the rest because there is some dot to dot quilting or that geometric quilting in the center. So kind of pulling out designs that you've used in other parts of the quilt, using them in a slightly different way, just can make it a little bit easier to pick out how you're going to quilt it. So that dot to dot kind of echoes the side. It looks really nice. I think it draws attention to the center without overwhelming it. And I was just glad to have an idea and how to finish it. So once I hit that point, I'm like, all right, now we're moving. We can finally kind of get this thing wrapped up. So a little bit of dot to dot. And then in between, so let me go back real quick. So that in between space between that shape and that edge, I'm like, oh, it's too big to leave unquilted. Well, I just added another echo line and then I added some pebbles on the inside to fill it in so I can call it done. So adding the echo, and I had my space and I can just quilt my pebbles all in a row. I love it. That's probably not my favorite part of it because I feel like it's a little too fussy. But again, that was this morning right before I came to work. So I'm like, this is what it's going to have to be. Now, if you're making a quilt and you're showing it to your guild or giving it to somebody, please don't point out that you don't like something. But I'm just saying sometimes you just have to go with it and know that when you're done, you have a finished quilt. So that was the last little bit I added in there, that little detail. I really wanted to do wishbones, but the way it kind of came to a point and wrapped around, I knew that it would just look weird. So I just didn't do that. So all in all, super happy with how it turned out. We have the pebbles kind of pulling from the filler, the dot to dot pulling from the center, and it turned out great. And so here is the finished product. I trimmed it up. It's not bound yet, but hey, I think it might just be another raw edge quilt. No, I'm just kidding. I'm actually going to bind it so we can hang it up, but you can kind of see a lot of that detail. Now, I do want to point out that when I take pictures of the quilt so that you can see it, I do a little bit of photo editing so that the quilting actually shows up. Even though I'm using that blue thread on the white fabric, it doesn't show up a whole lot in pictures. So if you're looking at this thinking like, oh my gosh, that quilting is way overwhelming, I promise you that I don't think that it is. And since I'm the expert in my opinion, I'm totally fine with that. So just know that if you think, oh my gosh, that quilting is over the top, it's probably because I have it edited. And then there is the finished product. I knew that I would have to trim it down a little bit because once I load it, it gets stretched out a little bit, or, not quite. It is a little heartbreaking to, trim off, stuff that you quilted. But I think the result is so cool. I have exactly what I was going for, that mandala look kind of carrying off, except for the last couple inches on the edge where I just did a filler. And I love that I was able to use the piecing in the center and the quilting to kind of grow off of that. Now, if this were a quilt with multiple blocks, I would now know how I quilted each block, and each one would be much quicker than this one. But since it's a whole quilt, it was a whole like learning process. So I hope that just showing you like some of the pictures will give you some ideas of what I'm thinking about or what you can think about when quilting your quilts. Of course, like I said, you don't have to go over the top and do it, all out like I did, but it's my favorite part. So I was super glad to do that. A couple things about it. I used 2 layers of batting to give it a little bit more definition. That's going to help it hang nice and flat. It's also going to make the quilting show up better in pictures. So I did it for you. Not necessary, but definitely like how it turned out. So I am going to answer some questions. I see Jessica writing down over there. But I do want to remind you that we have our 6th annual quilt walk coming up on June 8th. So I know not everybody lives in the Kansas City area, but if you happen to find yourself here around June 8th, I hope you'll pop by. It's our quilt shop. It's our big annual event. We have Jenny Doan doing a trunk show. I'm doing a meet and greet. We're doing a dinner with me in the evening and long arm classes. It's like a whole thing. So if you can, I hope you'll join us. If you can't, no problem. I totally understand. All right, let's answer some questions. Have I ever used a grip ring? If so, what are your thoughts? So if I'm understanding correctly, that is if you're quilting on your sewing machine and it's like a ring that you can kind of hold on to and it kind of gives you a handle to hold on to. I think it's great if you have hands, if your hands are a little weaker, if you have arthritis or something like that. I personally don't love it because you have to reposition it often and I kind of get into a rush, but I know that it can be helpful. What batting did I use in this quilt? So I love Quilter's Dream Poly batting. So it's the Quilter's Dream Poly Select is the loft. Ultimately though, I'd say it's just important that you use a high quality batting. Quilter's Dream is just what I keep on hand and I love the company and the product, so that's what I used. What thread color did I use on the white fabric? So it's actually Glide and it's baby blue. It's a light blue. It has just enough detail to show up. And I think I said in an earlier live chat, if I picked it because blue is my favorite color. If pink was my favorite color, a light pink would look great. If the orange was my favorite color, I might pick out, light coral. So you can kind of use your preferences to help pick out threads. Hopefully that helped. There's 2 spots in the very center of the quilt where I used white thread because I was doing some dense quilting in the block and I didn't want to take away from it. So hopefully that helps. Are my rulers in different heights? There was a short amount of time where they did come out with low shank rulers, but those have been discontinued by Creative Grids. So all of my rulers are 1/4 inch thick, which will work for, I would say, almost every long arm and high shank machines. I'm so sorry for those that have a low shank because sometimes they won't quite work. Do I avoid traveling on seams as much as possible or just stitch close but not in the open seam? I like to stitch along the ditch or the seams, even in an English paper pieced quilt, because it helps me move from one to the next. It kind of gives me that defined area to fill in. So I do. I'm trying to hit the seam perfectly, but let's be honest, like it's not going to be perfect. So usually it's more like it's kind of close to the seam. The one caveat or the one kind of exception I would make to that is, let's say I'm stitching on a seam that has like hot pink over here and white over here, and I'm using hot pink thread. If I know that one side is like the danger zone, I'm going to cheat it to the safe side just a little bit because, again, I'm not much better. I'm not saying I'm better at quilting. I just know how to hide my mistakes. Even if the quilting isn't perfect, I know which mistake is going to be less noticeable. So that would be an example when I would cheat to the edge. Which ruler did I use? I used the Smiley ruler, which I don't think I have one right here. I had planned on using my Taj ruler, but Taj was here at my building, our event space, and so I went with the Smiley ruler. And so all those arcs were done with the Smiley ruler, and then I used Slim, which is my straight edge ruler for the stitching in the ditch. Did I quilt this on my long arm? I did. Now, you could definitely do all of these things on a sewing machine. In fact, there's aspects that would have been easier. On a sewing machine, I can change the orientation of my quilt so that when I'm working with my ruler, I'm not having to work in weird angles. And on a sewing machine, I can start in the center of the quilt. However, I'm much quicker when I quilt on my long arm. So for this, knowing that, I kind of had a deadline, which wasn't that much of a time crunch because it was like 3 weeks, but it's busy around here. So I did on my long arm so it could be quicker, and it's just easier to take pictures as I'm doing it. So, all right, from Terry, I have a friend who overanalyzes some things. I call that analysis paralysis. Sounds similar to getting stuck figuring out quilting. Terry, you're so true. Analysis paralysis. Well, Jessica could tell you I don't suffer from that very often. not when it comes to like most everything but quilting. And I think it's just because, you know, I love it. I love to overthink it and think through it. So sometimes it's analysis paralysis, but sometimes it's like you're just so comfortable in the before because you're more scared of the after. So I love that. I'm gonna have to remember that. I'll be like, I suffer from AP, analysis paralysis. So very, very good. I like to joke, you know, like, oh, perfectionism and you know, attention to detail. That is such a skill to have in some areas, right? Piecing, perfectionists make beautiful quilt tops. I want my brain surgeon to be a perfectionist, right? Close enough is good enough does not count in brain surgery. But what I'm saying is if you're just so scared to start, that's what I want you to kind of get over it. So anyway, that was a totally different topic, not on point there. But anyway, hopefully that helped. If you have questions, like I said, you can leave them in the comment section. I get on there from time to time to answer. And I'll be back next Thursday with the next live chat at 3 p.m. Central. Until then, everybody, stay safe and happy quilting.